Hello and welcome to Community Thinkers, a broadcast mini-series from the Summit Hill Association. Thanks for joining us. In this series, we'll hear from one of St. Paul's most thoughtful people about an issue that matters to Summit Hill neighbors and St. Paul neighbors. I'm Sherry Johnson. I'm a process guide, inclusion trainer, and complexity coach. I'm also a board member here at Summit Hill Association.
And I am Monica Haas. I'm the executive director of the Summit Hill Association. I'm your go-to gal for information in Summit Hill. So you're probably wondering why we came up with this series. We decided that we are hosting this series to engage our community as we renew our neighborhood plan. We're finding that the more we learn about planning, sustainability, racial equity, and economic development, the more we realize how much there is to learn.
Yes. And this show, we want you to know, is for you. So after I get things started by asking a few questions from our guest, we'll turn to the chat where Monica will share your questions with them. And before we learn from today's community thinker, we want you to practice that if you have a chance. Go ahead and start asking your questions in the chat below. And we'd love also to hear what brought you here today. What are you hoping to learn in general? Go ahead and chat away, and we will see those comments in just a bit. So the community thinker we've asked to join us today is Merritt Clapp-Smith, urban planner and strategic thinker at Moxie Consulting. We'll talk about neighborhood plans, overlay districts, and pressing issues facing neighborhoods like ours. Welcome, Merritt, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Are you having any St. Patrick's Day treats today?
I bought my husband a brownie with bright green mint frosting on top.
Awesome. I will be throwing in my corned beef and cabbage here pretty soon. So the first thing we like to ask our guests is just basically to tell us about your history with Summit Hill and Grand Avenue. What's been your history, Merritt?
Yeah. I have spent most of my life living in the Summit Hill neighborhood, starting in the early 70s. In Summit Hill, I've lived in a number of different residences. I've been in a duplex, apartment on Grand Avenue, condos, single family home. It's really sort of had moved around within about 4 blocks, so not getting out too much. I did go away for a number of years at different points in my life. And then 5 years ago, we sold our single family home, which was on Goodrich, and moved to downtown St. Paul just to try something different. But there are a lot of things I still really miss. When I was in Summit Hill in the year 2000, I joined the Summit Hill Association. They were about to start their district plan update. And I was taking a break from my career. I had a master's in planning and had been working, but I was taking time off, staying home with my young kids. And they said, why don't you come on board? We're about to update our plan and we know you're a planner. And 6 years later, we had our plan adopted by the city, including the East Grand Avenue overlay. So it was an adventure. We did very extensive community engagement and took on discussing some pretty hot button issues, which at that time was about Grand Avenue and particularly about the change that people were seeing as independent stores were being lost and more chain stores.
For sure. So for our guests, I want to take a couple steps back and just ask you, what is a neighborhood plan in essence?
Yeah, so the city is broken up geographically into 17 different districts. Each has a district council and an executive director, like Monica, and a board like you're on. And for each of those districts, the city of St. Paul has asked that they put together a neighborhood plan every decade or more in order to provide guidance to the city around what their kind of community priorities are. And it's like a next level down from the citywide plan. where they identify different priorities in housing and transportation and land use. And so then they're saying, all right, kind of think about the citywide plan and then focus it down for your neighborhood. How would you carry that forward more specifically? And the neighborhood plan then is used in policymaking, investment, grant decisions by the city, or in theory.
Yeah. And it's been a while. We're clearly overdue as well.
Yeah.
Overlay district, what is that precisely?
All right, well, the whole city, each piece of land has a certain type of zoning. It might be a residential zoning, commercial, industrial, or a mixed use. And what an overlay district is you take, you have your base zoning, but maybe there are some principles you want to apply to a small area that sort of tie that all together regardless of the underlying zoning. So you put what's called an overlay. So it's sort of like a second level of zoning. So in the case of the East Grand Avenue plan, there are different zoning districts on Grand, and each had different heights and maybe design standards and setbacks. And so what the overlay did was it addressed height and the mass of building. So regardless of the underlying zoning, there would be a certain maximum height, a certain amount of massing along a block, and that would guide development that was happening. And when you have underlying zoning and overlay zoning, whatever the rule is, whether it's height or a setback or parking, whichever of those is more restrictive is the one that applies.
Gotcha.
And the East Grand Avenue plan was the only strategy that could sort of be thought of at the time to moderate the pace of redevelopment that the community felt like it was experiencing on Grand Avenue. And some people are concerned about the height of buildings or the mass, but it was as much about concern that new development always tended to come with, it would displace independent businesses typically, and come in with chain stores. And that's related to financing that comes from banks for developments and, reducing risk. And then it was also that, on the avenue, historically, you tend to have, lots that aren't that wide and a lot of variation between them. But when redevelopment happens, because of the needed economies of scale, you're going to tend to have a developer buying up a series of lots and then creating a development that, say, is a third of the block long, which is a very different scale. And so the idea on the East Grand Avenue overlay was to try to moderate that a bit. It was very controversial. I think some people felt that the restrictions were enough that it pretty much killed redevelopment, because with the height limits, you couldn't afford to buy the land, take stuff down, and build something new, and get your money back. And in some people's mind, that was just fine, and in other people's minds, it wasn't.
Right.
And I think right now that your district, your neighborhood, that's a really important thing to be thinking about, is how do you find the balance that was trying to be found back then in 2006? What does that new balance look like today? It's not going to be the same. Things have changed.
Yeah, and I guess that was my next question too. I mean, you've worked on a lot of developments, from, the Ford site to other metro stuff, and so you've gained a lot of wisdom and sort of seen those changes happen. What do you see is worth holding on to from that 2005 and 6 plan and overlay, or what seems like it's outlived its usefulness?
Yeah, I'll start with the overlay since we're just talking about that. I think that one thing really important and fundamental about Grand Avenue is that historic form of, smaller buildings and larger buildings. The corners tend to be, more built up, things are taller, the mid-blocks are smaller. And that's a very common form you see along St. Paul's old streetcar corridors. And it's an identity of the city and those corridors that has value. It probably brings value to adjacent properties. It's people like the spaces, they like the feel. But you also have a lot of development pressure, and development of new buildings, you know, in city policy itself is primarily directed towards commercial corridors. So what I think about a lot is how do you balance accommodating space for new development at a scale that's sort of economically feasible for people while still retaining some of that character. And I've really struggled with if there's some straightforward way to do that. And unfortunately, I don't think there is. I think it's more putting together something that perhaps recognizes and preserves some of the historic form while geographically, while allowing other areas to move to a different and probably larger scale of development. And so I'm not thinking that, say, all that development would go on West Grand and East Grand would be the historic side. I'm thinking more a small block by block level. So how do you figure out making the space for some new stuff, and then what is it most important to preserve? That's kind of how I think about it. And there's no silver bullet, nor, you know, the city sees vibrant places like Grand Avenue or Highland as important tax base opportunities, and you know, new development goes in, and that's something that is attractive to the city. So there are more pressures, obviously, on Grand for that type of redevelopment.
Yeah, and it reminds me of what the city is trying to do with those nodes, those high density nodes for transportation. Do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Well, I'm a planner, so I buy into the principles of, you know, when you have a concentration of different activities, you use resources efficiently. So, for instance, if you have transit, and people are theoretically using transit as an alternative to always getting in their car, then in order for the transit to be viable, it needs people getting on and paying. And that's only going to happen if there are lots of people along the transit line. And on the other hand, you're not going to have transit where there aren't many people. So, you know, the two reinforce each other. And I remember when I was working on the Ford site and we were meeting with Metro Transit, I said, so can you promise us you're going to like run a transit line through that development? And they said, well, only if you promise us that there are going to be a lot of riders.
I've always wondered what those conversations were like.
So it's sort of like, you first. No, you first.
Yeah. And then what about neighborhood plans in general? Sort of not even talking about Grand Avenue. What do you think is worth preserving from that 2005 plan?
Yeah. Well, I don't have specifics in my head, and that's really for everybody who's around today to figure out. But I think generally important things for all neighborhoods in the city to be thinking about are, you know, your transportation. How are you balancing cars and pedestrians and bicycles? And I actually think Summit Hill does a pretty good job already. So it's not like you're having to make up for a really bad system right now. It's one of the better communities. But it can be helpful when you're thinking through ways you might want to improve things, is to have people like look at an intersection or a certain street and have them rate it. Like, how good an experience is this? How does it feel? Is it safe? If you were walking it, if you were biking it, and if you were driving it. And then look at how balanced or imbalanced those scores are. So are you willing to take a little bit more traffic by, say, putting in an extra cross, you know, or slower traffic by putting in an extra crosswalk? You know, how making those choices and maybe balancing them better.
Gotcha.
Housing is a big thing. The city's growing. You know, it's predicted to have many more people coming in, and those people need places to live. And so citywide, all neighborhoods need to be stepping up and helping to take some of that growth. There's also a need for more variety of housing, both type and income level. And again, I think Summit Hill is one of the more diverse neighborhoods around housing type, and even has pockets of more affordable rental here and there. So it's thinking about how are you building on that to accommodate more housing? Where does it go? What is it? But really thinking about what's your share as part of the city, and then being proactive about saying, this is where we'd like it, as opposed to just trying to say, no, we have enough. So we're going to close the door, and then the city will ignore you, and then they'll just put it wherever they want it, and you've lost all control.
Yeah, that's really poignant. And then I feel like you've already answered this question, but I wanted to ask it anyway, because it kind of opens up the door. Outside of Summit Hill, like, what are the pressing issues facing neighborhoods right now?
Yeah, well, the housing.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think the transportation balance.
Okay.
And I think communities, cities are thinking a lot more about how the public spaces are designed and used by people.
Yeah, about that.
How do we have lives with one another outside of our residences or outside of our workplaces? And that, this, people have been talking about this for decades, but, sort of the neighborhood school is an old model. It's not that prevalent anymore. Your neighborhood churches isn't something that's as relevant as it used to. And in a place like St. Paul, people tend to go all over for that. And so how do we make the spaces we do share better for getting together and visiting and recreating? So I think a downside, one of the downsides of an affluent neighborhood, particularly if it has a lot of single family or small multifamily, is people have yards that they're spending time in. They have money where they're perhaps picking out some great sports program that's the perfect fit, or seeking entertainment that is just what they want to see, but it's 20 miles away. And so you don't necessarily spend as much time in those places around your neighborhood together. And Grand is one of those places where you can do it. But now that I live downtown, the only thing down here is multifamily. I'm next to a park, and I can't believe how much that park is our community space. Everybody takes their dog out there. If you want to throw a ball around, you go out there. You just want to picnic, whatever. So there is constant community in the park. And I feel that I know my neighbors, and I'm closer to my neighbors as much, if not more so, than when I lived in Summit Hill. And I'll add that generally the neighborhood is moderate to low income. So there are a lot of families here with kids, which might surprise people downtown, who can't afford to be sending them to sports and music lessons and everything else. So those kids come out and play pickup games in the park the way that I haven't seen since the 70s.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It's really great. And so how Summit Hill has some good spaces, how do you continue to think about those spaces as a way to bring people together?
My kid and I were literally just down on Linwood Field and sort of saying, wow, nobody ever uses these beautiful ball diamonds. How to make that happen? Yeah.
I know, right. So how, is there a new way to approach it? And it's more about the people deciding that they want to take that time together than about designing a good looking space. I mean, it's a people decision, and then the space is what they use.
Yeah.
And the last big thing I'd point out, which everybody's talking about, and it sounds like you guys are doing a really great job talking about, is equity and social justice. And we know that our city, along with everywhere else in our country, is a great example of economic and racial segregation played out over decades and decades and decades. And it's so evident. And what have we lost as communities because of that? How do we make each of our neighborhoods a place that somebody can choose to shop in or live in, kind of regardless of age, income, or race? How do we create a little bit of embedded diversity in our housing, in our transportation systems, in our entertainment or retail spaces. And it means changing things. It may mean giving up some privileges that people have gotten used to. But I think about, a lot of people think about what Summit Hill is today, and if they like it, they want it to change, stay the same. But in my lifetime, I've seen a lot of different forms of it. And so, for instance, in the 70s on Grand Avenue, that was really the shared shopping corridor for the largely white community south of Summit and the largely Black community north of Summit. And so at any given time on Grand Avenue in the 70s, at least a third of the people out there would be Black. And think about what that is today.
Yeah.
And
it's shifted north to Selby almost. Like we've divided ourselves again.
It's part of it. I mean, it's part of the residential change, but I think it's also the nature of the, the kind of atmosphere and shops and everything that gets set up in a community. And I think sometimes retailers moving into Grand think that the incomes of some of the people in the houses reflect extravagant shopping, which they don't necessarily. And then, but I think there was a lot of value in the way Grand Avenue functioned in the 70s. And what do we do not to preserve today like it was always that way, but maybe to think about how our neighborhoods functioned in the past in some ways that were better, and what happened that we don't have that anymore, and what parts of that do we want to get back to better address equity issues and social justice and just social interaction with one another, being around people that are different than us and seeing that as a value.
Yeah, amen. And then last question I want to ask every guest who visits with us during this series is, if you could snap your fingers and have your wish be granted, what do you wish everyone knew about planning?
Okay, sorry. I really like soapboxes, and I appreciate to have one. So, what I've been thinking a lot about how our cities, our communities, but largely our cities are systems, large systems, ecosystems of economy and land use and employment and housing, and everything's very intricately related. So a decision in one neighborhood has an effect on other neighborhoods. And, in our country over decades, we've, I think, increasingly wanted to believe that our own personal choices don't affect others. They can make their own choices, and then they can't judge us on what we do, and we can do whatever we want to advocate for the way of life we want. But that's not how it works. Everybody's choices impact one another, and I think it's important for us as a country, us as cities, to recognize more of that shared impact, that we really function as an organism, and to think about choices personally in your neighborhoods and how they do relate to things that other people are experiencing. And so when I think, this might be kind of radical, but when I'm thinking about community engagement these days, I wonder if we need to move away from the presumption of, if you engage immediate neighbors, that's all you need to engage, and think more about, do we need to be engaging people across the city that care about this particular issue? So for instance, the example I like to use, and might get in trouble, but the city puts together a bike master plan. And for the first couple years, the city council adopts it, and then they start bringing in segments and say, okay, now we're going to do this segment. And the people near the segment go, no, it's going to take away parking, it's bad. And the council member goes, oh, no, yeah, we can't do that. And then they go over and try in another neighborhood, and the same thing happens, even though all those council members voted for the plan. So it's stepping back and acknowledging that more of these things are systems, and that we have to make decisions based on that city perspective as opposed to a neighborhood perspective. And obviously it's both, it's not one or the other, but recognizing that it's both and being more intentional in how we do that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your soapbox. We appreciate soapboxes. So now it's time to look at questions from our listeners. Monica, what are you seeing folks want to learn or share?
Yeah, so David would like to ask, he says, we learned the overlay district and its restrictions can basically be overruled if a parcel is rezoned. This was a big surprise to us, as we thought variances would not be needed or would be needed, that the developer could not meet. If this is the correct legal interpretation, how can SHA move forward and be a needed stakeholder?
All right. I don't know if that's true. I'm not a land use attorney, but the intent when the overlay was put in place is that it would perform as an overlay and apply to every parcel on the avenue, regardless of zoning. That is the point of an overlay. It's not, you're part of the overlay unless you rezone to the specific type and that it doesn't apply to you. Now, I can't recall the wording well enough to know if there was something that we weren't aware of or not that was missed, and that is possible, but I think that's something that should really be explored. But bigger picture, if the city has an inclination to do things, allow variances or do zonings that ignore the overlay or take away its meaning, then that's the issue to be focused on, both on a parcel basis and along East Grand. Is where is the city at in its policy making around Grand Avenue? How does that align with things that you're thinking about as a community and other people around the city who are on Grand Avenue? And then what will you do about it? What is that if the city's at a point where it doesn't really like the East Grand Avenue plan anymore and it never really loved it in the first place, then what does the next thing look like that meets some of the interests you might have?
Yeah.
But check the legality of what they're saying. I mean,
I have more questions I could ask about that, but I'm gonna defer to Monica for now. What else are we seeing in the chat?
Denise asks, is it feasible to leave the overlay district in place as a means of controlling development? Example, grant permission for taller, bigger buildings with certain concessions from developers. For example, public space, building form and massing, etc.
Yeah, I mean, the city can grant variances. And they might, you can't legally say, I'll give you a variance if you give me a park. But it might be that, the intent, for instance, of zoning will be to achieve certain objectives. And if the development does something that kind of meets that objective in another way, that maybe makes the variance not as difficult because they've sort of met the spirit of the code, then that might occur. But generally it's best that your zoning match policy, not that you have antiquated zoning and keep negotiating exceptions.
Yeah, that's kind of what it's starting to feel like with market pressures now for us. I think, I'm going to actually follow up with a question. Recently, we got our market study back. We commissioned a market study, and we haven't put it in a form yet that we're releasing it to the public, but one of the recommendations there was to look at letting go of the overlay and trading that overlay out to do something like a developer guidelines, design guidelines that are very specific, and just replacing it with that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's certainly an option. To have more of a form-based design overlay. I think you have to come up with something to replace the East Grand overlay, whether it's a new type of overlay or something else. I don't know what it would be, because I don't think the East Grand overlay is on solid political footing anymore. I think it's very vulnerable. And so if you don't get out in front of it with something that's reasonable, then you're going to find yourself just on defense.
Gotcha. Thank you.
But I do think design standards are a direction a lot of people go. Instead of focusing on use, focus on design, and don't think of design as just height. Think of it as other things too.
Excuse me. Monica, what else are we seeing?
Luke would know, you alluded to a nuanced vision for a block-by-block evaluation of Grand. Can you elaborate on how this might work? For example, how would the community identify certain old buildings or design elements that can contribute to neighborhood character and should be preserved? How would such a process be designed to ensure that it doesn't become a weapon of exclusion or protecting wealth and privilege?
Ooh.
So I think of the wealth and privilege, that last part is more applying within housing areas. You know, if you're not allowing any type of new housing to occur, say within wealthier single family neighborhoods, that certainly can protect wealth and privilege. On Grand Avenue or other retail corridors, I personally see it through the lens of what is a certain historic or human scale design that you don't want to entirely lose. And then are you doing that through building specific preservation? Are you doing it through preservation of segments? Are you doing it through a zoning form where, say, you allow more density at the corners while preserving the density mid-block? And I think this conversation is as important for Payne Avenue and Rice Street and all of our old retail corridors as it is for Grand Avenue. It's about that historic character and leaving a little intact. So an example I've really seen recently that struck out is I've been in Bethesda, Maryland a couple times, where my oldest daughter now lives. That's how old the Summit Hill plan is. I was changing her diapers when I was working on the plan, and now she's graduated from college. But in Bethesda, I think it's just by chance, but they have blocks that are totally new development and built up higher and ground floor retail. And then they have a few block segments that are the original 1 or 2 story Main Street buildings and scale. And I think at this point it might be happenstance if nobody's gotten to those blocks yet. But to me, it seems like a really striking example of how you might sort of engineer, preserving some old character that really attracts people and allowing the new. Because I think one of the reasons people are absolutely adore Bethesda is because it has that mix of scale, that mix of built form. And sorry, I'll just give one other example. I spent a semester in Rome. And the thing I love about Rome compared to so many other cities is Rome on any block might have buildings from 5 different centuries on it. And so it's never sort of all wiped out, say during the Renaissance, and then it's all Renaissance or it's all arts and crafts or all something. So it's, can our cities be places where you have evidence in your buildings of time passing? And what does that do for us as communities, that unique feel, that niche? I think that's important, and it's important anywhere in our city, not just on a place like Grand where there might be more attorneys that can come to meetings.
It's funny you say that eclectic mix, that historic mix is,
right.
We're hearing that from some neighbors, but a lot of the time we hear about that character or that consistent feel, right? The historic feel and preserving that.
Right.
Yeah.
And it can be, there are some people that's absolutely what it's about. And for other people, it's veiled language that's just anti-development. And then depending on the side you're on, people will say it's all about people being exclusive snobs, or it's all about just caring about historic preservation. And it's not. It's about all those things depending on the person.
Thanks. Monica, I'm seeing more and more coming in here.
Yeah, Luke would like to know, I have observed that district councils tend to focus on the preferences of their local area at the expense of citywide needs. Your example of neighborhoods opposing the segments of the citywide bike plan is a good one. Are there ways you can think that district councils can change their policies or protocols that would remind them to place a higher priority on the bigger picture?
Yeah, it's a great question.
I think it'd be interesting. There are probably different ways to do it, but probably the only way it'd really get done is if, say, when the district councils are submitting opinions on things to the city, that one of the things the city asks that they address is how does the thing being proposed relate to citywide goals, as well as how does it relate to what the neighborhood is looking for. And so at least becomes an exercise for everybody to step back and think about their place in the city. They may not change the opinion they submit, but at least it starts to create that pattern of thinking that way.
Monica, not to put you too much on the spot, but in your time as executive director for Summit Hill, do you see us moving in that direction for district councils to think more citywide, or do you see us kind of hunkering down in our own?
That's a good question. I guess my experience for the last couple of years is it's pretty local, like neighborhood specific. It isn't quite what the city is looking for. Whether that's going to change when our plan comes out, maybe, but I'm not sure of how that will be received.
Got it. So you're kicking it back to us on the plan committee.
Yep. It's all on you, Sherry.
Awesome. Hey, no pressure. Anyhow, what else have we got in chat?
So Denise would like to know, on the idea of allowing development on some blocks properties but not others, doesn't that essentially unfairly prevent some property owners from developing their property while allowing others to do so? This could be perceived as allowing some property owners to profit more from their land.
Anytime you have different zoning or adjacent properties, you've valued the land differently. And the city has the discretion to do zoning and to do rezoning at any time. It shouldn't be doing spot zoning where it just like rezones one lot, because that starts to look, like it is very specific to hurting or benefiting one property. But if you allow some of the lots to have more development and others to have to stay where they are, then yes, some property is going to have a higher inherent value than other properties. That's simply how it works. So everybody who's invested right now is invested in Grand Avenue, hopefully, unless they're irresponsible, based on the premise that they can only do what the zoning allows. if you allow more than that, then some property owners will find themselves with a higher value property or potentially be able to sell it for more than they could before. So they would be getting a benefit that others that don't have that change happening. That's right. And there was also another question earlier. Renee was, I think, asking about variances in relation to trade-offs like affordable housing. At this point, the city can't tie any kind of zoning or variance decisions to affordable housing. The only way the two could be tied together is if the city adopts some type of ordinance that explicitly in the zoning allows certain, say, increases in density or height if affordable units are included in a building. But at this point, that mechanism is not in place.
That mechanism, say that again?
Is not in place.
Got it. Are you familiar with other cities that are going about using the zoning code to increase affordable housing?
Well, yeah, a lot of people are looking at it, and St. Paul is going to be looking at it at some point, I assume. And they're inclusionary zoning ordinances, or sometimes they're called,
That's
density.
the planning commission is looking at that again. Like it's kind of being required. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's tricky to get the balance right. But in our housing crisis right now, and wanting to provide better income diversity across our neighborhoods, it's an imperfect tool that people are grabbing for because there are so few tools.
Yeah. I'm seeing more come in. Monica, what else do we see in chat?
Denise made a good point that yes, we are starting to look more citywide as, our zoning and land use group have done some work with the RM zoning, with parking, with definition of a family. So in that regard, we are looking citywide.
Yeah.
Lloyd asked if there was overlay district copy somewhere on our webpage, and no, it is not there, but we will add it as soon as we can.
Got it.
And I think David then put a link to it in chat.
Oh, awesome. Way to go, David. Anything else you're seeing in chat?
Yeah, Sonia said zoning code does have bonuses for affordable housing.
Yeah, it's not on the top of my mind what those are, but that's how you can link the two.
So upzoning seems to be a loaded term. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Upzoning.
Upzoning. Is that what I said?
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So if you change zoning in a manner that it either increases the development potential or decreases the development potential, then people use the term upzoning if it's increasing its potential development because it increases its value, and it's downzoning if it reduces it. Say it was allowed to be 3 stories, but now they've changed the zoning, it can be only 2 stories. And, there are always legal challenges to downzoning, so it's pretty rare that happens without a really strong public purpose. So the city right now, to accommodate anticipated growth, to try to bring more jobs in, is in its comp plan identified areas across the city where it's going to be changing the zoning to allow more density, more space for buildings, people, jobs. And every one of those parcels that gets affected will be upzoned. So almost every term in our society, it's very easily politicized, but technically that's what upzoning is. and people do use it in a loaded way.
Yeah, yeah, on the left and the right, from what I've seen, and the center. So I would love it if our listeners who are in the know, I know there are a lot of wonks in the chat. If you can find and post the link to the St. Paul 2040 plan, that would be much appreciated. For those who have not seen it, that is what Merritt was just referring to, I believe. And then I'm seeing more come in here.
Yeah, Luke says, you briefly mentioned that one of the obstacles to small businesses has to do with financing. Banks prefer chain tenants because there's less risk of late rent. I imagine this is especially true now of new buildings. A developer would prefer to have Starbucks as a tenant than a local coffee shop. Are there any tools St. Paul or the state of Minnesota can use to change financing structures to remove barriers and difficulties for small local business?
I am such a fan of this question. Merritt, what do you got?
I am too, and it's almost a setup for our wrap-up item.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because this is something I meant to address. So thank you, Luke. So through the district plan when I was on Summit Hill, this is the issue that was the hot button issue, kind of small independents and chains, and development brings chains. So a couple of things to say. One, it is usually the financier that is making the choice for a developer by saying that they will only provide financing if they have certain anchor tenants that can guarantee, a multi-year lease, whether or not they stay in business. And they're going to look for names they recognize, like a Starbucks. And so it's something that often developers can't get around unless they are self-financed or have a relationship with investors that are more open to that, willing to take more of a risk. And it's really hard to crack that nut. I think if you want to, you have to find developers that do take those risks. And if you think you have a property that might be of interest to people, try to get the right developer looking at that property instead of one that doesn't have those relationships. Grand Avenue. So the East Grand Avenue overlay wasn't nearly as controversial as what we first started talking about as a tool for Grand Avenue. And that was called a formula business ordinance. So formula business is a chain. It can be defined in different ways. It might be 3 or more stores. They have similar signage. They have similar layout plans, whatever. So it sort of looks like you have a formula for creating a business. And a handful of cities across the US at that time had put formula business ordinances in place and prohibited in their commercial areas. And this was largely a tool used by communities where their retail district was full of fun independent stores, and that attracted tourists. And they knew that if those were replaced by chain stores, they'd lose their tourism base. So as a protective mechanism, it's obviously extremely controversial to bring up this notion of putting something legal in place that does that. And so the overlay became a different way to kind of get at the issue. But from that work, I was talking to a lot of small independent business owners on Grand Avenue. And as a group, a few of us ended up forming an organization called the Metro Independent Business Alliance to help promote locally owned independent businesses. And through those relationships, I learned that the most important thing a small business can do to survive is to be able to have an equity stake in its property, which is hard to do. And a lot of people that own commercial properties now are investors, and they're doing it because they want the rent. They're not interested in selling it off to people. So I think for the longevity and stability of independent businesses. We need to look a lot more at business ownership, co-op models, community-owned retail areas. I think that's just so important across our city, and especially in areas that are struggling economically, where people are, and small businesses that are vulnerable, like along University. If we can move a lot of those properties to community ownership, that's going to give them a lot of strength and integrity over time.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shop with your feet.
Indeed.
You choose who fails and thrives.
Yes. And I just want to put a plug in for us too. We're going to actually have Christina Nicholson from Nexus Community Partners come and talk to us about cooperatives. And we're also looking at having a guest to come and talk about community land trusts here soon too. Merritt's helped us find a good person for that. So we're going to reach out to that person. But yes, crossing our fingers that we can get her. So Merritt, no, that's good. So yeah, to close us down today, you already mentioned them, Metro IBA. I'm a member, and something we do every show is honor our local nonprofit community by sharing organizations our listeners can contribute to as they're able. It sounds like Metro IBA is the one that you want to plug. Do you want to say something about them?
Yeah, it's a great organization, and it's all about promoting small, independent, locally owned businesses. Helps just get information out. They support one another. They get information on how to succeed and thrive as an independent business. They have buyer guides. If you go to Metro IBA online and shop local, you can find the buyer guides. I know they recently, when I went on their website, have a special feature now for independently owned, Black-owned businesses.
Yes.
So I can't say enough about small independent businesses and how important I think they are for our communities and our economic base, because your small independent business person, has their graphics done by a local graphic artist. They hire the local attorney. I mean, much of the money they spend stays in the community. So it's a better way to bolster our own economy.
Awesome.
And they have, you don't have to be a business to join. You can just be a community member and you join because you love them.
That's awesome. Remember, so buy local. Anyway, Merritt, anything else you would like to share with our viewers today?
Just do good work. There's a lot of really hard stuff out there to think about. But I think everybody loves the city and is trying to do stuff that they think is great for the city. So try to get along as you work through those hard conversations and show respect for one another.
Oh, such lovely advice. Thank you so much, Merritt, for joining us today. So we've come to the end of our learning journey here today at Summit Hills Community Thinkers. Please share this show on Facebook, like our page for the SHA page to keep up with more content. Monica, what do we got coming this Friday?
We have Terry Tao coming, and I believe she's talking about equity in our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
She's awesome.
Yeah, she's awesome. She's program director for Nexus Community Partners and just has a wealth of information about housing, economic development, et cetera, et cetera. She's fantastic. Also, please plan to attend our April 22nd online meeting. The Neighborhood Plan Committee is hosting, where we'll share what we've learned from the community so far about the neighborhood plan and just check in with y'all, neighbors here in Summit Hill. And you're welcome to come if you're not from Summit Hill too, and see how we're doing with serving all of St. Paul. Well, without further ado, we're going to say goodbye. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you hopefully Friday at noon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.